The air was thick with smoke, the sky heavy with the weight of war. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect. What was supposed to be a place of quiet production, a factory tucked away in the heart of London, had become part of the war machine itself. It was early 1940, and the Blitz was a constant presence, its engines echoing across the skies every night. The Luftwaffe's bombs would fall, and the city would shake as if the earth itself was trembling with every explosion. People huddled in basements, hoping the next bomb would. I worked the night shift, a simple factory worker with calloused hands from handling metal, shaping parts for the war effort. Nothing spectacular. Yet you couldn't escape the war. Even here, deep inside the factory walls, you could hear it. The hum of engines overhead, the distant sound of bombs, I remember one night in particular. The factory was buzzing with activity, but there was a tension in the air, something heavier than the usual anxiety that came with working in a factory during wartime. I'd been putting in long hours, working on everything from parts for aircraft to tanks, while the world outside seemed to fall apart. We were all part of it, the machine, the war effort. But none of us were soldiers. We didn't wear uniforms. We didn't march. But we worked. We worked for the same cause. And somehow, in our own way, but then, as I stood there in the factory, watching the assembly line hum along, something inside me clicked. I had been watching these bombers pass overhead for weeks now, feeling that gnawing sensation deep in my gut that told me this war, this fight, was something I had to be a part of, something I had to contribute to. Sure, I wasn't a fighter pilot or a general, but I was a worker, a craftsman, a creator, and I had a mind for problem solving. So I started to think, what if that night, the idea started forming? I'd been standing there, stirring the coffee with a wooden spoon when it hit me, suddenly clear as day. What if there was a way to disrupt their systems, just long enough to throw them off course, give us a fighting chance? Now, I didn't know much about aircraft or bombs. Hell, I wasn't a scientist or an engineer. But I was a worker, and I knew tools. I knew how things worked, how gears turned, how metal could be shaped, how electricity could be harnessed. I had seen the engineers work their magic, piecing together massive machines out of the simplest parts. So I thought, why not give it a go? I went to the scrap pile, a few old parts from the assembly line, a piece of metal here, a coil of wire there. I worked by the flickering light of my desk lamp, piecing together my idea, connecting the dots. I knew it might not work. It probably wouldn't. But there was something in me that said, what's the harm in trying? The next day, I sneaked into the factory's lab where some of the engineers worked. I had no idea what I was doing. I attached the wires, plugged it into an old radio transmitter, and, well, it didn't exactly look like a weapon. It looked more like something my grandmother would use to stir soup. But it was mine. And for a moment, it was all I had. I watched as the engineers looked at it with raised eyebrows. Some of them snickered. A wooden spoon? Really? But I didn't care. Because what was I supposed to do? Wait for someone else to fix it? To solve the problem? No, I wasn't that kind of man, so I went ahead with it. I attached it to one of the bombers, one of the ones that would be flying the next day, and told them to test it. The device, simple as it was, seemed to work. Or at least, it appeared to work. It threw the bomber off its intended course. At first, they didn't believe me. They thought it was a fluke. But then, after more tests, they started seeing the results. The bombers, big, heavy machines of destruction, were being thrown off course. For a moment, it seemed like we had an edge. The Luftwaffe, the terror of the skies, had always seemed unbeatable. Every day they came, strafing our cities, dropping bombs that tore lives apart. And for so long, we had been powerless to stop them. But now we had something. Something simple, almost absurd. A wooden spoon. A little device I built myself with nothing but scraps. And for the first time in weeks, we had hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes, that's all you need. As the war continued, the device was refined, improved, and used by the Royal Air Force. We started seeing more successes, more bombers forced to veer off course. My silly invention became an essential part of our strategy. I was never a hero, not really. But in that moment, standing in the factory and hearing the distant rumble of a bomber being diverted, I knew I had done something. Something small, yes, but something that mattered. The Blitz had ravaged our skies, but it hadn't broken us. We kept fighting, kept building, kept inventing. Every worker, every craftsman, every civilian did their part. And that, in the end, is what made all the difference. The days blurred into weeks, each one stretching longer than the last. The sound of bombers overhead had become a constant, a harsh reminder that the war was never far, never quiet. Yet in the heart of the factory, amidst the constant hum of machines and the clink of metal, a subtle but powerful shift was taking place. My invention, a simple, seemingly absurd device, had started to catch the attention of those who knew. It wasn't just the engineers now. The higher-ups in the military were beginning to see the potential. And with each successful test, the device was slowly being integrated into the larger war effort. I remember the first time they put it to the real test, sending it out with a squadron of Royal Air Force bombers on a mission to intercept a fleet of Luftwaffe fighters. I was standing in the operations room, heart pounding in my chest, as the reports came back. The device worked, and it worked well. It didn't just knock the bombers off course. It disrupted their ability to make precise attacks, forcing them to scatter. We had our first victory, and it was something we could build on. But the truth is, I still didn't feel like a hero. Not really. I was just a factory worker, a man who had found a way to tinker and, in his own way, try to help. What did it matter if the invention was working? I wasn't flying those planes. I wasn't on the front lines. I wasn't watching the bombs fall, hearing the screams of men, and feeling the earth tremble beneath me. That was where the real battle was. The RAF's success with the device marked the beginning of something new. More and more bombers were fitted with the technology, and it quickly became a part of the broader defense strategy. The Luftwaffe, once a dominating force in the skies, now faced something unexpected. The thing about war, I've learned, is that it often hinges on the unexpected. The seemingly small or trivial ideas, the ones that are laughed at, dismissed, or overlooked, can sometimes be the very ones that change everything. It wasn't the big, loud weapons that made the difference this time. It was the quiet, almost absurd invention of a factory worker who simply refused to let the enemy win. And so, the bombers kept coming. But we were ready. The skies above Britain weren't empty anymore. They were alive with movement, with the hum of engines, the screech of diving aircraft, and the occasional thump of bombs falling far off in the distance. The RAF's response to the Luftwaffe was becoming more and more effective. The device was contributing, steadily disrupting the German war machine and buying time for the air defenses to fight back. But as the device's role in the war grew, so did the pressure. The work was becoming more intense. Every night the bombers came, and every night the device had to be ready. There were moments when the weight of it all would sit heavy on me, especially when I saw the faces of the men who would go into battle, knowing they were counting on what I had built. They weren't asking for recognition. They were just doing their jobs, as we all were. But the burden of knowing that my invention could make the difference between life and death, that was something I could never fully shake. Then came the night of the largest Luftwaffe raid we had faced yet. The war was escalating, the stakes higher than ever. The factory had been buzzing with activity all day, preparing for the mission. We knew this would be a decisive battle, one that could break the back of the Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies. It was the kind of night that makes your heart race with a mixture of hope and dread. The pilots who flew that night would be facing some of the most intense opposition of the entire war. As I stood in the operations room, watching the aircraft take off one by one, I could feel my palms sweat. This was it. The device was going to be tested in ways it hadn't been before. There were no second chances in war. You did what you could, and then you held your breath, waiting for the outcome. The first reports started to filter in. The device had successfully disrupted the German bombers. The squadron had made it through the first wave of attacks, the German planes thrown off course, their formations shattered. The RAF pilots were able to return fire, forcing the enemy into retreat. The battle was won. We had managed to push back the Luftwaffe. For the first time, the skies above Britain were ours, even if only for a moment. But it wasn't just the device that had made the difference. It was the work of every man and woman, soldiers, pilots, factory workers, engineers, who had done their part, no matter how small it seemed. The battle was fought in the skies, but it was won with every bit of effort on the ground. That night, after the reports came in and the factory went silent, I found myself standing outside, looking up at the sky. The air was cool, the sounds of distant explosions still ringing in my ears. But there was something in the air, something I couldn't quite put into words. It was the feeling that, for the first time, we might actually win this thing. The device had worked, sure, but more than that, we had worked together. We had stopped the bombers, bought the time we needed to turn the tide, and that was something that could never be taken away from us. As the days passed, I returned to my work at the factory, back to the grinding repetition of assembling parts, of building, of creating. But I had changed. The world had changed. And for the first time, I felt as if the small part I played in the war had meant something. The device, my device, wasn't just a piece of scrap metal. It was a symbol. It was proof that even the smallest effort, no matter how trivial it may seem, could have a profound effect on the course of history. The war raged on, as it always did, and the bombers kept coming. But we were ready. Every night, the sound of engines above us, the thrum of the Luftwaffe, would make our hearts beat faster. But we were no longer the helpless civilians hiding in the shadows. We were part of something much bigger than ourselves. We were part of a united effort, one that was determined to push back, to stand tall in the face of unimaginable odds. And as I stood in the factory, watching the workers around me, I knew that we had done our part. The sky was no longer just the domain of the enemy. It was ours. And for that night, at least, we had won. The war wasn't over, but it would be one day. And on that day, we would look back and know that we had done everything we could. We had fought with everything we had, and it had been enough. And that, my friends, was the moment the world changed. As the months wore on, the war continued its relentless pace. The sound of planes in the distance became a familiar, almost haunting rhythm in the air. The skies above Britain were no longer as silent as they once were, but the Luftwaffe, with all its might, still came. They came in waves, day after day, and their presence weighed on every soul below. But there was a quiet assurance in the factory now. The device, my device, had become part of the fabric of the war effort. It wasn't the only tool in the arsenal, but it was one of the few that had been born from the simplest of hands. From a humble worker who'd known but there was something more to it now. Something that was growing in the back of my mind. Something I couldn't ignore. The war had changed everything. And I had changed with. You see, the problem with war, what no one tells you, is that it doesn't just reshape the world around you. It reshapes the person you were before. The man I was before. The man who worked in that factory, with his hands dirty from sweat and metal, was no longer the same. The person I had become was a part of something much larger. A machine that was grinding away, slowly but surely, in an F. And yet, every night when the bombing started, it felt as if we were back where we started, trapped in a cycle of survival. Even with the device working, the bombers still came. But there was something different now. We had a fighting chance. We weren't waiting to be hit. We were hitting back. The sound of our engines joining the Luftwaffe's was no longer a sound of surrender. It was a sound of. It wasn't just the military that noticed the change. The civilians, the workers, everyone knew something had shifted. People began to hold their heads a little higher. There was a sense that, just maybe, we could win this thing. That little invention, that silly idea I'd had so many months ago, was now being used in more places. The Royal Air Force was adopting it, the Army too. And for every bomber that was stopped, one night, as I walked back from the factory, the noise of the war felt distant. I had just finished another long shift, but I wasn't tired. I was alive. The weight of the invention, of what it had become, still hung heavy on me. But it wasn't the same weight I had felt months ago. No longer was it a burden. It was a mission, and I had become a part of it in ways I never expected. That night, the sky was clear. Clear enough to see the stars, something we hadn't seen much of during the constant bombing raids. As I stood there, I couldn't help but think of the men flying those bombers. I thought of the families in London, huddling together, waiting for the bombs to fall, never knowing if they would see the sun again. I thought of the workers in the factory who kept pushing forward, who built the very planes that fought the enemy in the sky. And I thought of myself, just a man who had done his part, who had tried to make a difference. But it wasn't just me, was it? No, we were all doing something. We were all part of something much larger. Each worker, each pilot, each person in every city across Britain. It was a strange kind of unity that formed under the weight of war. We were all linked together, in one way or another, by the desire to survive, to protect what was ours. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The device continued to prove its worth, with each success bringing us closer to victory. But there was always more to be done. The Luftwaffe didn't stop just because one of their bombers had been thrown off course. They came back again and again, testing our defenses, pushing our limits. But every time they came, we were ready, and each time they were pushed back. But the cost was high. There were losses. Lives were lost. Men, women, families. And every time the air raid sirens went off, I would think of those who had made it through the last time. Would they make it through this one? The sound of the engines overhead was always a reminder that war was unpredictable, and nothing could be taken for granted. We had won battles, but the war was still raging. In one of the quieter moments, I remember a letter I received from a soldier, a man who had been part of the first group to test the device. His words were simple, but they stuck with me. "We owe you one, mate. Your little invention saved lives today." Those words, coming from a soldier on the front lines, made everything worth it. It wasn't the recognition, it wasn't the fame, it was the knowledge that something I had done, something born of nothing more than a simple thought and a wooden spoon, had made a difference. It had helped save lives. It had helped stop the bombs from falling, if only for a moment. As the months stretched on, I could feel the war changing. We were no longer on the defensive. We had started to take the fight to the enemy. The tide was turning, and the Allies were beginning to push forward. But even as victory seemed within reach, I knew the cost would be high. The road ahead would not be easy. There would still be battles, still be losses, still be sacrifices. But we had something now, a fighting chance. And that, I thought, was all anyone could ever ask for. The war would eventually end, and we would all go back to our lives. Some of us would remember it all, some would forget. But for me, the memory of those days, the quiet moments, the sound of the engines, the weight of invention, and the pride of knowing we had fought back, would always remain. We had done it. We had fought, not with weapons or fancy gadgets, but with simple tools, simple ideas, and a quiet resolve that said we would not give up. That, in the end, is what the war was really about. The smallest things, the humblest of contributions, can make all the difference. It was the kind of quiet that can only come in the midst of chaos. The hum of engines, the rhythmic drone of the Luftwaffe above, became part of the air we breathed. It was as if the skies themselves had been torn apart. And we, the men, on the ground, had no choice but to learn to live under the shadows of war. I can still hear the distant thud of bombs falling, the earth shaking beneath our feet, as if it too was trying to escape the horrors above. But there we were, ordinary. I had no illusions about the scale of it. The Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, they were powerful, relentless. The Blitzkrieg had already shown us the raw force of their might. The world had seen the swift advances of Nazi forces across Europe, like a flood that washed everything in its path. The Soviet Union, though vast and powerful, was already locked in a brutal struggle on the Eastern Front. But here, on the ground, we were the ones left to pick up the pieces. We were not soldiers, not pilots, not generals. We were factory workers, engineers, civilians caught in the great machinery of war. And it felt like nothing we did was enough. The sound of engines above us, the crack of artillery in the distance, it never stopped. The first time I heard it, really heard it, I couldn't quite believe it. The dull roar of the engines growing louder, closer, until it swallowed everything around us. The Luftwaffe was coming. The air raid sirens screamed their warning. But it didn't feel like a warning anymore. It felt like a call to action. You could almost feel the weight of history pressing down on your chest. It wasn't just another bombing raid. It was part of the larger picture, the relentless assault that would eventually push the world into the war's final chapters. And yet, in the face of it all, there were moments of clarity. Moments where you could feel the world shift, just slightly, as if the earth itself was catching its breath before the next onslaught. In those moments, when the sound of bombers overhead became almost deafening, there was nothing else. No more factory, no more munitions, no more machines. There was only the fight. The very air felt different. The familiar hum of the factory was replaced by the sound of men murmuring, the rustling of paper as plans were drawn, voices muffled by the panic setting in. I was just one of many, but I couldn't escape it. I couldn't stand by while others did what they could. I'd worked in the factory for years, surrounded by the clinking of metal, the rhythmic pounding of hammers on steel. And there, in that factory, something happened. You'd think I'd just been lost in my work. But when the engines came closer, when the sky seemed to darken with the threat of another raid, it hit me. We could do something. We had to do something. I remember the night I had the idea. It wasn't much, just a moment. An idea that seemed foolish, really. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal, the sharp tang of sweat mixed with the burning of machinery. A wooden spoon was sitting on the workbench beside me. A simple thing, really. But something about it, something in that moment, clicked. What if somehow we could disrupt the bombers, throw them off course? What if we could find a way to fight back from the ground, not with tanks or planes, but with something simpler? I'm not an inventor. I wasn't some great mind in a lab. I was just a factory worker, one of many in a long line of people who'd been swept into this global conflict. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we could do more. So I tried. I took a wooden spoon, some wires, and metal scraps from the factory floor, and I started working. It didn't look like much. It was ridiculous, really. The others must have thought I was mad. They probably thought I was just another guy trying to find something to do to get through the long nights. I wasn't sure what I was doing. I didn't know if it would work. But I kept thinking about those bombers, how they would tear through the night, how the sky would fill with their engines, and how helpless we were. What if I could use the same airwaves, the signals they were using, and somehow disrupt them? Could it be possible? Could I, with something as simple as a wooden spoon, affect the course of this war? As I worked, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all, the sense of responsibility. Every time I heard the air raid sirens, my heart would race. You could almost feel the earth tremble beneath you. People all around us were scrambling, hiding, praying. But I was here, working, trying to make something that could change the game. I didn't want to be a hero. I didn't want recognition. I just wanted to help, to make sure that the next time the bombers came, we weren't just waiting in terror. We could do something, anything, to make a difference. The first test was a failure. Of course it was. There was no handbook for this, no manual to follow. But I didn't give up. I didn't know what would happen, but I couldn't let go of the idea. I worked through the night, tweaking, testing, adjusting. It was all trial and error. But then, one night, as the first planes flew overhead, something happened. My invention worked. It didn't just disrupt the enemy planes, it threw them off course. They couldn't target their bombs. The ground was spared, if only for a moment. I remember hearing the first report of success. The sound of the radio crackled as the message came through. "It worked," they said. "The enemy has been thrown off course." There was a moment, a pause, when I wasn't sure if I'd heard right. Could it be? Had we, with nothing but a simple invention, actually made a difference? And so, the tests continued. With each success, the word spread. The device became more than just an idea. It became a weapon. But it wasn't just the device that was changing things. It was the spirit of it all. The spirit of a people who, when faced with the might of the Luftwaffe, could still find a way to fight back. We may not have been soldiers, but we were fighters. And that, in the end, made all the difference. As the weeks turned into months, I watched the skies change. They weren't silent anymore. They weren't just filled with the sound of German bombers. They were filled with the roar of our engines, our fighters, our planes fighting back. And for the first time, I knew, deep in my bones, that we were winning. It wasn't just the bombers that had been stopped. It was a shift in the tide of the war. The Luftwaffe, once invincible, was being beaten back. Not by the might of guns or bombs, but by a simple invention born from the mind of a factory worker. And for a moment, as I stood outside after the bombs had stopped falling, I realized the truth of it. Sometimes it's the simplest things, ideas that seem foolish or insignificant, that can change the world. It wasn't the bombers or the tanks or the armies that were winning the war. It was the ingenuity, the quiet strength of the people who refused to give in. And in that moment, I knew we had won, and the world would never be the same again. The days after the war ended were strangely quiet. The roar of engines, the thrum of planes, the distant rumble of artillery, everything that had filled the air for so long was suddenly gone. And in that silence, there was nothing to do but reflect. The world had changed, and so had I. But it wasn't just the world around me. It was the man I had become, the person shaped by those years of conflict, by the moments of hope, desperation, and triumph. After the war, things went back to some semblance of normality, but normality was something we could never fully return to. People went back to their jobs, their families, but there was a lingering heaviness, something unspoken that sat in the air, in the hearts of everyone who had lived through it. The war had left its mark, not just in the loss of life or the ruins of cities, but in the quiet resolve of those who had fought in ways they never imagined. People like me, factory workers who had never signed up for battle, but who had still found themselves part of the war. My invention, the device that had once seemed so insignificant, was now a part of the story, part of the legend of those days. It was never meant to be a centerpiece of any grand narrative. I never asked for recognition. But as the years went by, I came to realize that recognition didn't matter as much as the fact that we had done something. Something small, maybe. But in the chaos of war, sometimes it's the smallest things that have the greatest impact. I think back to the night I first came up with the idea. How absurd it seemed. How foolish. A wooden spoon, some wires, a few scraps of metal. But in the quiet of that factory, amid the hum of machines and the constant pressure of the war, it became something more. It became a weapon of hope, a weapon of survival. The first few tests of the device had been small victories. Each successful test meant that we could push back against the Luftwaffe, just a little. But with each success, I felt the weight of it all. The stakes kept getting higher. I wasn't a soldier. I didn't wear a uniform. But every time I heard the planes overhead, felt the vibrations from the bombs falling, I knew we had to do whatever we could to survive. I never thought I would be part of something so big, something so meaningful. But here I was, a small piece in the larger machine of war, doing my part as best I could. We all did our part, in our own ways. The pilots in the skies, the soldiers on the ground, the engineers who built the machines of war, and me, a factory worker with an idea and a belief that we could change the odds. As the years passed, the world moved on, and the war faded into history. But the memories remained. The faces of the pilots, the soldiers, the people I never knew but whose lives had been touched by my work. Those faces stayed with me. They didn't need to thank me. They didn't need to acknowledge me. I wasn't looking for glory. I was looking for a way to help, to contribute, to make sure we could keep going. The war was over, and we had won. The Luftwaffe had been pushed back, and the skies were no longer a place of terror. The city, once reduced to rubble, was slowly being rebuilt. People were moving forward with their lives, and the world was starting to heal. But even in the quiet moments, the memories lingered. Of the planes, of the sound of engines, of the nights when we thought we wouldn't make it. But we did. We fought. And in our own way, we won. As I sit now, years later, I can still hear the hum of engines in my memory. But now it's a different kind of sound. The sound of resilience. The sound of people who refused to give in, who refused to let the war define them. The sound of a world that refused to break. And as I look back, I realize that it wasn't just the grand victories that mattered. It was the quiet moments, The moments when we did something unexpected, something small, but something that made all the difference. It wasn't the tanks or the bombers or the guns that changed the course of the war. It was the ingenuity, the simple actions of ordinary people who, when faced with the unimaginable, found a way to fight back. And that was the moment the world changed. In the quiet of the fields, as the war faded into the past, we knew that sometimes the smallest of actions could change the course of history.